Hello, and welcome to another Empire podcast. I'm Angus Foggie. Today I'm talking to Matt Pennington and Andy Raff about Eternals. Hi, Matt and Andy. In case people are listening for the first time, we should introduce ourselves.
I'm Andy Raff. I'm lead writer and sort of campaign guy for Empire.
I'm Matt Pennington. I'm sort of all-round person for Empire. I contribute on the campaign and everything, basically. I have a role in every part of what PD does.
So I'm Angus Foggie. I'm just a player at Empire. In the game, I play Cormac Dunn, who's the editor of the Oathright newspaper, and I've moved from editing people in-game about their characters to editing the likes of Andy and Matt from the game team on podcasts. Today we want to talk about Eternals because you've spent a bit of your winter time rewriting the pages on Eternals and Realms. Perhaps we want to start out just by saying what Eternals are. What are Realms?
So Eternals are powerful, otherworldly creatures. The realms are the 6 realms of magic which exist in Empire. Spring, summer, autumn, winter, day and night. And they are kind of the source of magic in the world. And they represent our kind of metaphysical otherness. They're kind of what makes it magical world, effectively. And the Eternals are the powerful occupants of those other 6 realms. And they fill a space in our game representing powerful supernatural beings. In other systems, you might have fairy lords or demons or anything like that. And that space in Empire is filled by the Eternals. I think we got the name from William Blake. I think it's from William Blake.
Yeah, it might have been. I was going through a period of reading some Blake stuff while we were putting them together, which is one of the reasons Urizen is called Urizen, incidentally, fun fact. But there was an element where we wanted something that captured the fact that they were supernatural and weird without going with a sort of focusing on their power. So we hit on something that basically hinges around the fact that they're immortal, that they are always there in the background, rather than that they're much more powerful than the PCs. It's more the idea that they're a constant presence in the game world, which is something we've played around with a few times, and it works out. It works out quite nicely as a category. And then it was an easy matter for us to come up with the idea of heralds, which would be their messengers and servants in the world. It's a nice evocative name, and one of the pieces of work we've just finished off is finally writing up a piece of work. I think, Matt, you did it like years ago, like literally like a decade, in which we broke down the various categories of creatures from the supernatural realm. And we've been using that as an internal document for a decade, and constantly saying we really should get around to writing that up so players can read it. And that was one of the things that jump-started us doing this little bit of review work over winter. And so now we have our page on the wiki about inhabitants of the realms, where we finally talk about guardians, drudges, and boggarts. Despite having run 2 years of heavily boggart plot, we finally tell people what they are, which is pretty standard for PD, though. Yeah, so that is a rough guide to Eternals. We're pretty clear on a couple of ideas. Matt and I disagree on some of the details. We always do, but we're pretty clear on the idea that they are powerful, but not omnipotent or omniscient. That they are interested in the mortal world, that they are motivated by their agendas, and that they are, even when they're being complicated, they're actually reasonably straightforward. They're defined by their goals and their agenda and their view of the world. And we want all of that to be true because we definitely want situations where the player characters can outwit them, can manipulate them, can exploit them. So we say a lot they're not gods, and they really aren't, because they would be a lot smarter and harder to rile if they were gods, I think.
Yeah, they're quite monomaniacal. They're really only interested in their specific thing.
Yeah, that's really important, actually, because that is one of the things that makes them very different to what I would regard as a mortal NPC in our setting. A mortal character, ideally, should have a range of interests and things that they care about. But if you try and raise something they don't care about, they might take an interest in it because they might think, well, this could advantage me. That's the way a normal person acts and responds. There are things they care about, and then they take an interest in the things you care about. Eternals don't really do that, or they shouldn't really do that. And they're not designed to do that because their focus, they just almost by their very nature, in my opinion, they don't really give a shit about anything other than the things they give a shit about. So you can't haggle with them or negotiate with them to get them to take an interest in something they don't care about, because they're basically constrained by their nature. They're not mortal beings who are interested in these things. They are expressions of concepts. So, Eleonaris is those principles, those ideals, those ideas that Eleonaris stands for. And you can't get them interested in other things, because you might be able to get them to talk about it for a minute or two, but as soon as the conversation ends, their interest just ends. These things just don't register to them.
There's a little more complexity though, because if they were just one note, A and B, yes, no, sort of binary NPCs, they'd not be much fun to interact with, and they wouldn't be a massive amount of fun to play. And we might just run them as I don't know, NPC dialogue trees, because what makes them interested in the mortal world is that we are keen to give our Eternals personalities as well. So to use one that I've got a fair amount of experience because I play the NPC, Sodogwa is primarily is motivated by a love of magic and magicians, and wants magic and magicians to be the most important thing for everybody else in the whole of creation. But at the same time, he's also desperate for approval, validation, and flattery from mortals, because he's a hollow little man with an empty heart. And that means that there is something you can interact with. There are hooks that you can manipulate. Eleonaris is proud and expresses these ideas of nobility. But like many of the Summer Eternals, she has a hair trigger temper and is really easy to get offended if people aren't showing her suitable respect. Whereas our Halligan broadly doesn't even necessarily care about that sort of stuff. He just wants to make sure that you are aware of the fact that he is the biggest predator in the room and act appropriately. Because if they didn't have those personality traits, it would be a little bit like interacting with a robot, or there was a very early AI program called Eliza, which was a very simple set of responses designed to get you to talk about your problems. So we give them personalities, and that's where the NPC comes in, personifying these powers while constantly remembering that they have an agenda, that unlike a mortal, that their red lines are built into their nature. They genuinely can't act against their nature, I think would be the best way to do it, because we want them to be something that is both powerful and, to a degree, predictable.
Yeah, the predictability element's really important. You're never going to have a conversation with a Herald of Ephesus where they say, well, to be honest, at the end of the day, I'm not really interested in trade. They're all interested in trade. They all want to sit down and haggle and negotiate and talk and offer and buy and sell, because that Eternal is constrained by their nature. But as Andy says, the personality can, from one Herald to another, or from an Eternal to another, will be different. So that can express in different ways. But the predictability is really important, because otherwise you don't, as a player, you don't have the way to sort of be in control of the situation, which is ideally what we want.
It also differentiates them within our political game. If you're debating points of ethics with somebody from the Commonwealth, or we want to get across the idea that there are lots and lots of different people in the Commonwealth, just like there are in the Empire, and that is much less, and that distinguishes foreign power blocks from Eternal power blocks, I think.
Eleonaris doesn't have any factions. She's completely in charge of her army. They're 100% on her side.
Yes, quite. There is room. I mean, right, so again, if you were to look at somewhere like the Autumn Realm, the classic would be the City of Locks, which is an Eternal, I don't know what's called this week, Basilia. Basilia is Basileia is an Eternal that is all about treachery and infighting and political rivalry and so on. So obviously, within their sort of ranks, you would absolutely expect endless infighting and treachery and overturning, and indeed that's what the Empire sees, or I hope they see when they look at that Eternal. With Eleonaris, what you might expect is something more akin to powerful lords and ladies, all of whom ultimately give their fealty to their liege, to Eleonaris, but who might have not feuding, but a certain degree of rivalry. So briefly, Hayek was in Eleonaris's court and was a kind of important noble figure in her court, and that had consequences. basically, it's never simple, but if you look at what the ideals and the ideas they represent, you would expect to see that spiraling through the nature of the people that they are, that the heralds that are part of their entourage.
And weighed against them, I don't think there's many rival factions in the day realm at all.
No, sign of Keenan.
People are all,
No.
yeah, people are all singing from the same song sheet because that is part of the thematic elements that we put together for that area of magic.
Yeah, it's highly ordered, highly disciplined, highly structured.
And differentiating the realms and the Eternals that live in them as much as we can is another element of what we try to do. We don't want anybody to ever be confused about what realm an Eternal belongs to based on their actions. And there is some grey area. There's a lot more factionalization and treachery in Jaehaerys's part of the Summer Realm than there is in Gath and Kanai and Elinaris's, because that is part of the nature of that Eternal. But it's all about creating these broad stroke stories that can be narrowed down into their interactions with PCs, because like almost every element of the game, in fact, like every element of the game, they only really exist when they are interacting with or creating situations for the player characters on the field at Anvil to talk about, think about, or role play with, basically.
So how do players interact with Eternals? Where are the points of contact?
So the big one is the Archmages. It took us a little while to get it going, and it's easy to forget that when it started, the Magic game at Empire was completely different to what it is now. We came up with our incredibly inspired, a year after a once in a millennium time of crisis within the Empire, the Conclave completely changes, which I think was your suggestion, Matt. And at the time, I thought that was ridiculous. And now I think it's ridiculous, but it's remarkable how well that has gone across. So originally, the Archmages weren't what they are like now. But one of the things we did when we rewrote the Conclave the first time, I think it was the first time, might be the second, was we gave the Archmages a power called Plenipotentiary, and we established the Archmages as being effectively high-powered magical ambassadors to the appropriate realm. And one of the key powers that they've got to make real that ambassador status is Plenipotentiary. Each Archmage, every event, can send a message to one of the Eternals of their realm, requesting aid, asking for a meeting, asking questions, all that kind of good stuff. And that is your big glowing red button that you press if you want the Eternals' attention. And then at the next event, we do an early Wind of Fortune, usually referred internally as the Plenipotentiary Wind of Fortune, obviously, which deals with the responses of those Eternals. And some or all of them will arrange encounters either face-to-face with the Eternal or more commonly with one of their favoured servants, because we want to save the actual meetings with the Eternals for a little bit more drama and a bit more, in the nicest possible way, budget of our time to put them into play. And that is the big one. You get the Archmage to speak on your behalf, and you are going to get a response of some kind from the Eternals. It might be purely downtime, it might be uptime. It depends entirely on how we think that is going to be framed well. And that is the big one. That is the way you pull the Eternal lever. I think that is fair as saying that is the main one, Matt.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really, I think there's something straight away that you could draw out that's the classic Empire game design. So there's 6 plenipotentiaries in an event and 3,000 players. And you might think, well, that ratio doesn't seem to work. If you think the game as a player is about your interaction with the Herald or with the Eternal, then the maths simply doesn't make any sense. It doesn't add up. Why are there 6 when there's 3,000 players? It doesn't make sense. But we don't view Empire in that way at all. In Empire, the primary forms of interaction, the most important interactions, things that actually make the game cool and exciting and enjoyable and interesting, are the interactions between the players. So that the game at Empire isn't really the conversation that you have with the Eternal at the Plenipotentiary. That's the payoff. The game is the protracted negotiations between you and other player characters, where you try to convince the Archmage, who's another player character, to do your plenipotentiary that you want done instead of somebody else. So it's that the Eternals are functioning both as a supernatural entity, and for all the things we talked about and about making the game more magical and so forth, but they also fit within a classic PD paradigm in which they exist to give players something to role play about in terms of the access to them and the politic over and to discuss.
Right, so we've got the plenipotentiary, but there are lots of other ways to get in touch with the Eternals too. I mean, there's rituals that speak to them.
So a couple of the Eternals have got rituals that allow you to directly send messages to them. They are most commonly associated with the Eternals who are desperate for validation, because they're really tricky for us to support them, and for us to try and make them different and interesting. The method whereby you send a message to Sodogwa, for example, is very different to the message whereby you send method rather whereby you send a message to Maraud or the Whisper Gallery, all three of which are currently in Imperial law. And there's a couple of reasons for that. It is not a small amount of work to respond to all of those messages every event, and also it is potentially tricky sometimes to respond to messages sent to Eternals. We don't want those messages to short circuit the plenipotentiary system, because, as Matt said, that's where the politics is in a lot of this discussion. So those rituals do exist, but we're really careful about putting them into play. More commonly, there will be a person on the field, somebody with a title, who represents a specific Eternal whose interest in the Empire is high at the moment, or who has a specific service that they want to offer. So, for example, the Celestial Librarian represents Phaleron from the Day Realm, and most of the time they just tick along in the background. But to make that to make that status real, we give them an ability to request some information from the library every event. And those are a form of communication, but they are more subtle. But that sort of power we've got. For example, there's a Herald of Tharim's throne. There's the Shadowed Torchbearer, whose role is to represent Janen's obsession with sort of passion and heightened emotional states and similar. And all of those player characters are kind of positioned to be like an intrusion of the Eternal onto the field that we don't have to keep running. Well, we don't have to reach in and do stuff. They generally get asked to do things by their Eternal, and they often have a way of responding to that Eternal's requests. And also, if you have a real interest in Janin, or hero point rituals in Night, or passion as a form of virtue, or what have you, then tracking down that PC is one way for you to be able to explore that relationship, because they have some ability to sort of step to one side of the plenipotentiary system. The risks being that there's no guarantees with that sort of communication. The other way is that, in addition to the formal plenipotentiary stuff, our plot writers are regularly running plots with the Eternals that interest them, that they think they've got something cool to do on the field, and they will be sending their representatives out, and you can, as a player, buttonhole one of those representatives and have a chat with them about stuff. So again, that's a way that we make the existence of the magical realms and the supernatural creatures that live in them have an effect on the field at hand.
I think there's a couple of things to say there, is just to pick up. I mean, you covered a lot of the bases, but obviously it would be trivially easy for me to extend the database system so that players could send messages to every Eternal in the same way that they can send winged messages to every NPC that's on our database or whatever. But we deliberately don't do that, and that's partly because we have a wide palette of Eternals. There's half a dozen or more in every realm, and we're regularly doing plot with one or two Eternals in a realm at any given time. So the other three or four are kind of quiescent, and we're not running plot with them. So if you were to just write to them, haven't really got anything to say. We haven't got any real interesting way to respond. And effectively, you can't force PD to write plot for you. Well, you can, but the number of levers you can use to do that is quite limited. Plenipotentiary effectively forces PD to give you a plot response. Writing and that's the key. Plenipotentiary forces PD to give you a plot response. Writing, sending whatever that stupid ritual that sends a message to Sodogwa on a 5x5 grid is basically like sending him a PM. It doesn't force a response. He will try and reply, but it doesn't make Sodogwa have a plot response to what you're doing. You're just chatting with an Eternal pen pal, effectively. Is that fair, Andy?
We try and make sure that a response is written, and then I stick it in a bottle and throw it out to the void, because, as you say, it's a pen pal letter. But the purpose of that ritual, it's interesting. We don't really say it specifically, I think, but the purpose of that ritual is to give PC magicians an opportunity to ask questions about magic and similar and get a response. And those are the missives that I'm really careful about responding to. They serve an in-character purpose as well, which is about letting us know what some players are interested in. And if I had, and we are scrupulous about trying to reply, but they almost never. No, they never lead to an actual encounter that uses NPCs and similar. There's a couple of other responses. We have those with all the Eternals. Something might pop up in the Winds of War related to it, Winds of Fortune rather related to it. We might send something back like a magic hat of +1 intelligence or something. But for the most part, they are those communication rituals are a way to your pen pal analogy is pretty good. They are a way to chat with an NPC via Facebook Messenger, and you should expect to get about the same level of response. Sometimes they'll ring you back, but more often they'll say lol and put a smiley face.
The other thing I think is worth saying is, in terms of meeting NPCs on the field, if we say, oh, this Herald of Barrion is going to be in this location at this time, that is because that Herald of Barrion has a very clear goal that they want to achieve, and that goal is best achieved by being there in that location at that time. If you turn up and try and convince that Herald to do something completely different, so you say, well, you've come here to find the people who are on Barion's quest, but can I, convince you to send an army to attack the Yatoon? You're going to get pretty short shrift, because effectively you're trying to, completely subvert the plot of what is actually happening there. A much better way to interact is to think, okay, I really want a relationship with Barion. Their herald's going to be there. I'll turn up and do everything I can to help that herald achieve their goals. And at the end of it, maybe slip in the sort of thing I might like. Effectively, those opportunities are about, seeing when heralds are about is a way to try and build a relationship with a herald or an eternal over time. It's not like plenipotentiary. Plenipotentiary is the hand grenade of plot interactions. It basically demands the Eternal's attention. It requires the Eternal to respond. Chatting to one of their servants who is going about their business can get you somewhere, but they won't drop their business and start doing what you want them to do instead, because they're there to do a plot and do some business and do the thing they're trying to do. So it can be hard. It can be hard trying to make quite deliberately it's hard to make contact with an Eternal, because partly as well, we don't want the whole game to be about interacting and talking with them. We want them to be an element of the game. We don't want them to be everything.
There's another area of contact that we haven't talked about yet. A lot of the rituals that we cast depend on the good favour of an Eternal. And so when we're casting those rituals, we're effectively getting their aid, and we can sometimes they ask for things like Eleonaris wanted us to start building statues because we cast our spell so often. Or we can annoy them by using Ilium to make their magic castle permanent, which turns out to be stealing their castle, and now they don't give us their castles anymore. And perhaps also, I'm not too clear about this, but the regios are dedicated to a realm, and then we can dish them out, take them away. I'm not sure if that bothers them or not.
The Regio one is pretty straightforward. Every Regio, with the exception of the Imperial Regio, and a couple of wacky ones that have turned up on plots and player events because they're cool, is connected to one of the realms. Some Regio shift between two realms at certain points to create drama. It's mostly just ripped off from a tabletop role-playing game called Ars Magica. Don't tell anybody that. The thing with Regio is that they are effectively tunnels. One end has a door at the in the world the players exist in. One end has a door that opens out into the appropriate realm. The tunnel in between is the place where you meet Eternals and Eternal Powers, the chambers kind of thing. But in the mortal world, they're relatively, for the most part, relatively fixed where their physical location is. But because the realms are magical and weird, that's not necessarily the case. So we've regularly run plots with things like Halligan wants to seize this Regio from Ossagran, or Maraud and Catherine Kanai are competing over this area in the Summer Realm, and whichever one of them takes control of it will take control of this Regio, and we give play characters an opportunity to get involved in those. And that can have knock-on effects, because if a Regio that is connected to the realm of our Halligan in the Spring Realm is going to have different vibes and different thematic stories that you would tell about it to one that's connected to Irahara or Lofir. And that is kind of where the Regio comes in. It gives us opportunities to do some odd stuff, to make play decisions important, and as always with Empire, to nudge us back in the direction of politics, of interacting with effectively foreign factions that want to control resources and are prepared to bribe or browbeat or blackmail player characters into helping them get what they want. And that is, I think, a rough summation of what the Regio situation is, Matt.
Yeah, totally. You know, you mentioned Ars Magica, and no doubt that's kind of one of the inspirations, because that tabletop game did this so beautifully first. But there's a point here which is true of Eternals and true of Regios, that they're designed to give us the tool and the pieces that will allow us to tell some of the classic fairy stories, some of the classic legends and myths. You want the pieces to exist in the world that allow you to not retell a classic myth, but basically create your own myths in the same vein. So the idea of a magical place, you know, a fairy glade in the wood that if you wander into it, you might not be able to wander out. A place where that you go to meet the fairies, and the fairies are there, and you have a mystical, magical experience, and then you find your way out of it, and you can't easily get back in. All of those things, if you think about it, are just classic tropes of myths. Now, some Jungian might suggest that represents something about the fundamental human psyche and tropes or some shit like that. For me, they're fundamental because they're just great things for telling great stories with. And so we want those things in our setting because they give us the capacity to tell interesting stories. And that's really important in a closed world, because if we didn't put those things in, when somebody said, oh, well, I want to create a story, I want to create a plot involving a strange haunted ruin where X is happening because of this, and we're like, oh, well, you can't really do that in Empire because we don't have anything to represent that or reflect that. That doesn't exist in our setting. So there we could go, yeah, that's a Regio. Sounds like a Winter Regio. No problem. Here's the rules for how that works. And here's all the kind of wider mythology that fits into.
Well, one of the things I like is because we're always trying to think back towards the players. We then gave, unlike in the real world stories that they're drawn from, we gave every magician in the game a massive crowbar. So the Operate Portal spell, which is a basic spell any magician can cast, completely ignores what the Eternals and Heralds and magical creatures associated with the Regio want and allows you to come and go as you please. So it's only people who aren't magicians who get trapped in a fairy Regio for 200 years, because every magician has got Operate Portal. And it's just little things along those lines. We can still run the story in which people get trapped in a Regio Rip Van Winkle style.
Yes, what Andy said's really important because it goes back to that principle of empowerment. We don't want to tell a story in which your player character gets caught in a Regio. It's just not a story that's going to work in Empire. We're never going to come to you as the player and go, yeah, sorry, you're trapped in that Regio for 100 years, better make a new character. That's just not a thing that's going to happen to you. But it could happen to NPCs. You know, you can bravely go and rescue those NPCs because they're not heroic and have exceptional skills like you do. So the tools are there to tell the story, but then we give tools to the players to be able to force the narrative of the story to conform to one in which they are really powerful agents of change rather than helpless agents being swept along by events. You know, there's a whole set of kind of stories that you can tell in which people are basically powerless and swept along by events. And we're not really very interested in telling any of those stories in Empire, not when those people being swept along are players. So we deliberately put the kind of tools in that would make those stories impossible, because the players would take the One Ring and just cast words of ending on it. It's just be like, that's that problem sorted. Trapped in a magical place. Right, cast Operate Portal.
It's more that's that problem changed into a different problem than that's that problem sorted. But
yes,
we've been talking about Regio so long. I forgot what the first part of the question was. Thanks.
The first part was about the rituals that require an Eternal's friendship.
Yes.
Oh, yes. Okay. We've been doing a lot of work on that actually over the last couple of weeks or so.
Yes, this has been like one of the big focuses. So there are, you said a lot of the rituals, and I don't think it is a lot statistically, but several important rituals have call on the power of an eternal for aid. And we have slowly formalized the rules for that over time, but some of our rituals that were put in the game early on don't really necessarily perfectly well conform to the rules. And in theory, that's not a problem. It doesn't actually matter, but except for the fact that it gives players the wrong impression of what you can and can't do in the game. And in a game where people could create arcane projections to create their own rituals, that's a problem because they keep running into these walls where they're trying to create rituals. And we say, no, you can't do that thing you're trying to do without the help of an eternal. And they might legitimately point at the wiki and go, well, this ritual doesn't do that. So we've done a whole load of work. Andy wrote a big page, which is yet to go up, talking about the interactions, how it works, how this aid is negotiated, what the rules are, and all that, and then goes through the 4 key cases where you might need the help of an eternal. We talk about how that works, and then I've done my sort of pass edit on that, and that is as soon as Andy's checked my edit of his writing, then that is ready to go up. But implicit in that, we're going to do a cleanup of some of the older rituals that are in the system and get them all to align cleanly with the rules that exist in the game.
So there's a couple of reasons why we've done the setup where there are rituals that don't need eternals, which is the majority of rituals. It's just that the big ones and the cool ones seem to be the ones that often require eternals. I am mostly joking. And we've done that for a couple of reasons. One of the key elements of which is that a ritual that needs an eternal is automatically more political in its nature than a ritual that doesn't. I think that's fair to say, Matt.
Yeah, and this actually goes, I think we've talked about this before, goes right back to the heart of the Eternals. One of the things that's interesting to me about an Eternal, if you can go down to the ritual circle and just cast a ritual and it just happens and there are no interactions or role play or consequences of that, that's a very mechanical thing. But actually, one of the things Eternals do is they put a face and a personality on magic so that there are consequences and implications and potentially role play and negotiations with magic itself. So as a magician, you are bargaining with powers and you are negotiating and dealing with them to obtain the aid that you want. And again, that's an essential, like a really common part of our myths and stories, but it's also cool role play interaction in a way that you telling the ref you've got 20 magnitude and can cast this ritual isn't cool interaction. So it's, some of the rituals, the reason we have eternal involvement in rituals, one of the key reasons we have eternal involvement in rituals is to add this element of negotiation and bartering and dealing, and the idea that there is a higher power that you're calling on here that may need to be bought off in some way.
It also adds, I think, additional weight to things like conclave declarations. It is, if, to use an example, our Halligan eats an entire village of Navarre, then it's pretty straightforward that they're not a nice person. You should probably enmity them. But then somebody can put their hand up and say, if we enmity them, we will lose access to, because of the way Imperial law works, the rituals that our Halligan has sponsored, one of which is currently quite vital for the war effort. So what's more important? Our ability to use this ritual that our Halligan sponsors, or our moral and ethical duty to the people who've been eaten by giant spiders. And it's a small factor, but it complicates what should be a really easy, straightforward decision, I think.
Yeah, totally. If you look at, and the great example of this was the hoo-ha over Eleonaris and the stupid statue that she demanded. And that demand for a statue is absolutely in line with the kind of vain, regal nature of Eleonaris. She is proud and haughty and demands that you kind of flatter her in that kind of recognition of her status as a great and powerful lady. So she says, right, I want a statue. And the Empire went, no, that's a pointless waste of resources and might just be, a religious crime, and we're not doing it. And then Eleonaris said, right, well, if you don't do it, here's what's going to happen when you cast my ritual. And because that ritual is a very powerful ritual and very magically advantageous for the Empire's armies, you can't just ignore it. You might decide not to agree to Eleonoris's demands, and that's totally a legitimate IC thing to do. But that decision has really important consequences because of the interplay of magic and personalities. If you refuse to flatter Eleonoris in that way, then that will have consequences because that Eternal has a role to play in the magic that the Empire wields. Whereas if they were just a plot element, you'd be like, right, yeah, tell Eleonoris to shove it, we're not interested, get on a bike, get lost, and then you'd be like, all right, well, we don't run any Eleonoris plot, and the players might legitimately say, yeah, we can live with that, thanks. That's not really a consequence because you're just going to run plot with a different Summer Eternal, and they'd be right. So, having that interplay with the magic allows us to create really profound consequences for the players, for the decisions they make.
And because the backup ritual, if we lost Eleonoris, was something to do with zombie soldiers, and it was much less good. The military council were insistent that we keep the Eleonoris' friendship, and the Senate kept saying no, it sounds criminal. But then it would go back to the conclave, who would say, well, there's no other way. You have to build the statue. And this ended with the Master of the Mint, Gancio. We got the statue approved, but nobody provided any money for it. And he paid 200 thrones,
Jesus.
200 thrones out of his own pocket on a Sunday afternoon, because otherwise, this was it. It was the last minute. There was no one to pay for it. So he paid with his own money to build this statue. We then asked for the money back, and we ran a cartoon in the Oathright of a huge statue with Gancio sitting at the bottom holding a hat, begging for his money back.
That's awesome.
I'm outraged by the way that you think Quickening Cold Meat is in any way worse than Knights of Glory. Knights of Glory just gives you a bunch of delightful elves, but Quickening Cold Meat gives you 1,000 flesh-hungry ghoul zombies. There's no comparison.
But I think when Military Council said it's less numbers, right?
Yeah.
Plus less.
Oh, wow. Okay, so if you're going to go on numbers, yes, I suppose it isn't quite as good, but it provides you with significantly more flesh-hungry zombie ghouls than Knights of Glory does.
But it is less numbers. One of the things that's really important, players sometimes get frustrated by this. The path in which you don't agree to the NPC's demand is often less good for you. It's usually less good for you because there isn't really a plot in which refusing the NPC demands is just straight up, obviously on paper, better for you, because then you just refuse it and you're like, it's a no-brainer. The plot is in the payoff and the trade-off and the fact that every player in the field will have a different view of that trade-off and therefore will argue about whether you should do it or not. So you're always looking for a sweet spot in which you can agree to the NPC's demands or whatever and get an outcome that is X good, or you can refuse their demands and get an outcome that is half X good. And it has to be kind of worse, otherwise there's no game, actually.
It's interesting, though, if the players had said, get stuffed, Eleonoris, we'll create our own army enchantment rituals with blackjack. Eleonoris' ability to influence the Empire would have been reduced.
Yep.
So it's not a one-way street of you either do what the Eternal wants or you don't. There are outcomes that are different, that are more challenging. But we, as we always bang on about, we don't mind which choice you make. There's no right or wrong choice in this scenario. It's just that one of them reduces the influence of a Summer Eternal over the Empire and costs you a powerful army ritual. So presumably some players will work to try and find a way to work around that, or you accede to their blackmail attempts, keep your ritual, but you've acceded to a blackmail attempt.
What you can't do, and what you do see players do quite often, is the trick to negotiating with an NPC in Empire, if you don't like the offer on the table, is to try and pivot to a new offer. You want to try and offer a new solution, a different thing. What you shouldn't do is go, okay, NPC, you've asked for a pile of gold, and in return, you'll give us this piece of land. But how about you give us this piece of land and we give you nothing? How about that as our offer? That, provided we've briefed our NPCs properly, will never work, ever. You can't just go in there and go, how about you just give us your stuff and we give you nothing? Which is actually, it sounds insane when I say it, but that is a very, very, very common negotiating tactic. That is often, the assumption that you can just sort of browbeat the NPC till they just give you what they want. The assumption, I think, is if you role play at them long enough, they will just give up and give you what they want. And that isn't the case, or certainly it's never meant to be the case. You can't just role play at it till the problem goes away. But you can come up with a genuinely innovative, different solution and go, well, okay, we're in a Gordian knot, but how about if we both agree to do this?
Do we have to always offer them something that we're planning to pay them? I mean, can we trick them? Can we use treachery?
You can certainly trick them, but tricking them's dangerous because, PD are going to know you've tricked them, probably. And if PD know, then the question is, at what point does the Eternal know they've been tricked? Now, the interesting thing, and this is really interesting about Eternals, is they are bound by their nature. Thing I'm really passionate about, that if they say they're gonna do something, they're gonna do that thing. They're not lying to you, and they can't lie, actually. Then we could go into sort of structural reasons why we might do that from a game design point of view, but they're just committed to doing what they say they're going to do. So if you trick Eleonaris and go, "All right, we give you this and you give us that," and Eleonaris goes, "Yep, I'll take that deal," then Eleonaris still has to follow through on the deal even after they discover they've been tricked. But boy, they're going to be pissed with you. They'll be really, really pissed.
You can trick the Commonwealth, and then after that's happened, the Commonwealth will send some quite snippy letters to the ambassador, and some ports will start getting shut down. It's just more immediate with the Eternals because they represent magical rather than temporal power.
Yeah, if you piss off Eleonaris, you might expect to see a lot more elfin knights fighting with the Yatun than you would have otherwise anticipated. So the question is that, and again, it's meant to be a trade-off all the time. Is it worth it? Is it worth it? Are the benefits worth the costs? Because our game is about players having to assess those things and decide amongst themselves whether the benefits are worth the costs. It's always a trade-off of some kind.
A lot of the Eternals, incidentally, have odd value judgments. So, an obvious example from play, without mentioning any names, an Archmage of Autumn once, not tricked precisely, but secured a binding promise from Sodogwa by doing a heartfelt rendition of a song from Phantom of the Opera that was in context and other things was very appropriate, because that particular Eternal, there is a note about the fact that they like that kind of thing, that somebody once kind of repaid a debt to one of the most spiteful and petty winter Eternals by smashing up a wedding cake. So it's likely that you would struggle to find something that will please Eleonaris as much as building a statue, but there are pressure points on our Eternals. When we talk about them having personalities and goals, there is some space for something that isn't you give us what we want and we give you nothing, and is instead you give us what we want and we make a different kind of concession that doesn't cost us as much in terms of money, but might cost us in terms of role playing. For example, I've no idea how Eleonaris might have responded if a bunch of enchanters had turned up and said, to show our respect for you, we're going to add your lion to the heraldry of all of the armies of Dawn. And that wouldn't have cost money, but it would have had a social cost, a political cost. It could have made Eleonaris happy, but then, I don't know, triggered concerns in Highguard about idolatry and things like that. What Matt is getting at is what you can't do is say, we will just roleplay at you and you will do the bargain thing that we want. But there are concessions that cost different. And each Eternal, all the good Eternals, all the ones that I think have got meat on their bones, have at least a couple of pressure points that are not pile up all of the green iron.
Yeah, quite. I think the interesting thing is to compare it with like a classic computer game, role-playing game. You think about the classic, and Andy's talked about like dialogue trees. The essence of the classic computer game is you are going to see the NPC. You want to get them to give you the key to the portal. And what you have to do is hit the right entries in the dialogue tree until the NPC goes, "Ah, yes, brave adventurer, here is the key to the portal," and they hand over the item. And that's creates a kind of mentality, or trains you into a world in which you can go through the dialogue options until you get the outcome you want without a cost. And Empire tries to avoid that at all possible costs. all of our characters, whether they're eternal or temporal, are offering bargains and deals and offers. And you could change the offer. You could say, let's consider something completely different. What you can't do is say, well, I'll take the offer, but I'll just not pay for it. I don't want the price.
I'm going to pivot us out of this slightly because there's been something burning a hole in my chest that I want to talk about. There's a common misconception, I think, with some magicians that by using an Eternals ritual, you are somehow thanking or supporting or doing a favour for the Eternal. And in actual fact, from our point of view, it is the other way round. When Eleonaris sends her knights, you are progressing her agenda that people should have, should do knightly stuff and fields of glory and all that sort of stuff. That is true, but that is not helping Eleonaris in an economic or you're not doing a favour for Eleonaris when you cast that ritual.
He is doing a favour for you by providing you with 3,000 or 2,000 elven knights. The person doing the favour is Eleonaris in that relationship.
And it's codified because of the way rituals and assurances work. And the Eternal is, for the most part, happy to do it. But as you mentioned, the situation where some Farushkans very cleverly sidestepped having to pay attention to a Knight Eternal. They are providing their castles. You are not helping them out by summoning them. And it's a key thing to be aware of when you're trading stuff to Estivus using the ritual that allows you to swap metals and measures for Autumnviz. That isn't increasing Estivus's power. That is providing Estivus with the materials that they use to make magic items. In return, they pay you. And it's I think often a misconception. If we are having a plot where an Eternal is asking you to cast their ritual for some reason, there is something else going on.
I thought I'd heard that Eleonaris had grown in stature because we'd cast Knights of Glory so often. That there was some way that she was being boosted by that she was kind of dominating the Summer Realm more. Am I wrong?
Yes. Yeah, that's just not true.
Yes. I've been poking back around some of the stuff around that plot. One of the triggering factors on that is we talk a little bit about how the fact that casting lots of Knights of Glory can sometimes cause problems. And what Eleonaris is actually doing is, from her point of view, the knights that she's providing to the Empire are helping them win these glorious magical victories. And so, consequently, she wants a little bit of attention for that, a little bit of recognition of the fact that her Summer Knights are helping people win these glorious battles against the Druids and things. And that is where that is one of the places that particular plot about wanting a statue evolved from. Crucially,
it does not make Eleonaris more powerful that the Empire casts that ritual or not. That's just not. It's not a thing. Not a thing. And if it were, and one of the reasons because if it were a thing, then our plot would be rewarding the players for casting that ritual a lot, which would make no sense at all in our game, because we don't want players to cast a ritual a lot to earn the favour of an Eternal. We want them to cast the ritual a lot because they really want that ritual to beat up their enemies in the military war or whatever it is they're using a ritual for. We want them to do it because of the positive effects on the setting, and the negative effect is that you then are in hock in some way to that power. If it boosted the power, you wouldn't be in hock to them, they'd be in hock to you. So no, categorically, it couldn't work that way. It would be antithetical to the game design that underpins it all.
So go back to the trickery and treachery point. So you were saying, we could trick them, but so they're not trying to trick us then?
No.
Matt has said no a little bit too quickly, but 99 times out of 100, they are not trying to trick you. And in that 1%, I'm thinking of some specific plots that I can't really talk about. They are doing a classic con man trick of allowing you to trick yourself.
You have to explain that.
Sometimes, particularly the Winter Eternals, will offer a deal that appears too good to be true. They won't be lying to you about what that deal means, but there could conceivably be considerations that are not immediately apparent to everybody in the room.
Constant theme of Winter is learning harsh lessons through punishment. That's a kind of idea of Winter. It's a mythic idea that the Winter Realm is associated with. So if you interact with Winter Eternals a lot, you might expect to learn some punishing lessons over time, or you might find the realm is trying to do that, and hopefully you can evade that outcome. But they won't be tricking you. They will be, ideally, they would be allowing you they would be giving you the rope and suggesting you might want to hang yourself with it.
The classic example that we use when we're talking, that I use when I'm talking about this for plot writers is agreement may offer you a boon that will help you gain an advantage in a certain circumstance, and all he wants in return for that is for you to promise that you will go to this Druge village and kill everybody there. And you might be able to find out a little bit more, or at the very least realise that agreement is being a little bit cagey before you get there and discover that that village is populated entirely by former imperial citizens who've been enslaved by the Druge, for example. And that is definitely tricking you, but I would hope that at the point where agreement's representative is getting a little bit cagey about exactly who is there and why he wants it done, the players would back away from that. There is more going on here than we are aware of. But agreement wouldn't be lying. He would provide you with the power that he'd offered you, and if you killed all the people in that village, despite the fact you've just done something terrible, he would be pleased in a sort of, yes, you've learned valuable lessons about things, and I'm more than happy to deal with you again. Or you might say no, at which point agreement quite legitimately could say, I gave you the power that I said I would do. You agreed to do this simple task for me, and now you have defaulted on our agreement, and now you are in the wrong as far as myself and my fellow Winter Eternals and indeed Winter Magic are concerned.
The point there with Winter is to tread carefully about what might the consequences of this offer be. The offer is the offer. They're not lying to you about what they're asking or what they're offering in return, but they are inviting you to do something that might turn out to be much more dangerous than it appears, or much more painful than it appears on the face of it. And that's the most deceptive and treacherous we get. And that, interestingly, gives us problems. So if we look at someone like Basileia, who is all about sort of treachery and double dealing, and we're like, well, we have to sort of contort ourselves a little bit and be like, well, why doesn't this Eternal constantly deal treacherously with the Empire? And they don't, because you just wouldn't deal with someone who did that. Again, this all goes back to some underlying game design principles that in Empire, the NPCs are either never lying to you, or in this case of the few specific exceptions, the obvious one is the Druge, they're always lying to you. You know, if you deal with the Attoon, if you deal with the Grundle, if you deal with the Fool, whatever they say is the truth as they know it and they understand it. They're not lying to you. They all have cultural reasons why they think lying is a really, really bad thing to do. None of them are trying to deceive you. The Eternals are bound by their nature. If they say, I will do this thing if you do that thing, then they are bound to go through with that, because they're sort of creatures of oaths and agreements and so forth. So they have to follow through with what they do. The Druge are the one obvious example. The Druge are always lying to you. If they say, can we have a peace deal? We promise not to attack you. They are definitely at some point going to attack you. And what we want to avoid is the players going, well, what can we believe? What if the NPCs are lying to us? Because actually that isn't a conversation that's we think produces any interesting game. You have to be able to trust that the information that you've been given is valid, because the game is about what decisions do we make based on the information we have? If the answer is, well, none of the information we have is reliable, well, none of the decisions really make much sense then. You're just guessing. So, yeah, the Eternals are not trying to trick you.
Caveat, some of the Eternals are trying to trick you, but they're not doing it by lying to you about what they're going to do or planning to break the confines of a deal that they've just made with you.
Yes, what they say is truthful.
Although some of them do things in different ways. I have, while NPCing certain Eternals, regularly said things like, well, only an idiot would tell you the truth there, but I'm going to tell you the truth right now. Or obviously I could be lying, and then I'll say something that is blatantly a lie in the most obvious way I possibly can, because lies and trickery are a complicated area, but we are not trying to trick you out of character.
Yeah.
And it's pain. It really is. Certainly, there were some early plots in which there were misconceptions that came back to bite us a few years later. But I think most of those are now in the past, and we can all move on.
Basically, we've been doing a load of work on this, and there's going to be updates in the next week or two. where we're going to update some of the ritual pages, put some more content on about all these parts. So yeah, you'll see a lot of stuff that was a little bit ropey here and there will all get brought into line and made much more consistent and conform properly to the sort of internal style rules of Empire.
So it says on the wiki that you have sometimes you change an Eternal because you feel like they're not providing any useful elements in the game. What it says, which made me think: does that mean all these Eternals are currently being used? Now you've mentioned already that you only run plots with perhaps some of them at a time. They're not all necessarily in active plots. But the question that really piques my interest as a player is that occasionally, I've ran across like secret meetings that have been happening between players and Eternals. I have met genuine cultists of Agrement, and people who were dealing with Skaith, the wedding cake being destroyed for Skaith. Does that mean that there's players out there at the moment making secret deals with Lothier or Halogen or the Cold Sun? I mean, I realise you can't probably say, but
there's like 3 tiers of Eternals, kind of. So the entire Eternal palette of the Eternals that are on the wiki, unless there's a really good reason not to, are available to our plot writers if they want to use them, if they've got an idea for something cool to do. The A tier, which, and these tiers shift all the time, are the Eternals that are currently actively pursuing open, obvious plots involving the Empire. So, for example, the whole castle situation with Sodogwa is a live, ongoing plot. There's a lot of stuff around it. I'm really enjoying watching stuff like the growing movement in the marches to have him condemned as a lying toad. There have been meetings around that. Likewise, the changes in the city of Locks, or the stuff with Maraud being trapped down a well, which is a bit of an in-joke, but it's a plot that started developing last time. They are the A tier. There's a B tier of Eternals who are bobbing along in the background: Agrement cults, Whisper Gallery allies, Ira Hurrah encouraging a group of people to do Ira Hurrah stuff, that kind of thing. And then there's kind of the C tier, which are the Eternals who are there in the background, just cheerfully bopping along, waiting for something interesting to happen. They're not currently being actively pursued by plot writers. Player characters aren't poking them with sticks, but they are there ready to sort of rise up suddenly if we find something cool to do with them.
The reason why we have occasionally sort of changed an Eternal or dropped an Eternal, because in theory we ideally we wouldn't do that, but over time, a lot of we created a big campaign world and filled it all out and put all these elements in it, but over time you kind of identify that an Eternal isn't really a useful. If we keep finding we're never telling any stories with this Eternal, we're never running any plots with them, or when we do, the plots always go wrong, and they always go wrong in the same way, and that probably indicates there's something wrong with the design of that Eternal. There's something it's not a question of whether they're in use at the moment. It's a question of, well, why are we never using this Eternal? Why do we never get any interesting plot or game out of them? And if we're not ever getting any interesting plot or game or interactions out of them, then they're sort of heading towards the chopping block of irrelevance. And we might try and sort of take them apart and put them back together in a different way that would make them useful.
So the obvious example from play is Sogta and Murrit in the Night Realm. They were okay. They were a bit esoteric in Sogta's case and a bit one note in Murrit's. But one of our plot writers, I think Chris Allen came to us and said, "You've been complaining about these for a while. There's this little throwaway line on a page somewhere. What if I run a plot in which we combine them into their original form of an Eternal who is all about the philosophical principles of alchemy, transformation, change, exciting stuff, inspiration, all that kind of nighty stuff?" And I was really enthused by that. And Chris ran his plot for a year. We centered PCs on it, but we also used other elements coming from outside, and they had some influence over the exact shape this Eternal was going to take. And Azoth has done, oh man, he's done that Eternal has been involved in so much more stuff that has been interesting, cool, than Sogta or Murrit were in their entire period of them being two Eternals. And that is kind of what we are looking for. If an Eternal is a bit, I don't want to say esoteric, some of them are quite esoteric. If an Eternal isn't achieving something, if it isn't encouraging, if it doesn't have a clear role in the game where it is the Eternal you want to talk to, then we need to think about what that space could be better used for. And in the case of Azoth, we ended up with a much more interesting Eternal who is much more proactive and much less responsive than Murrit and Sogta were. I'm really pleased with the way that turned out.
Yeah, it's a good one. I know the Academy have had a lot of fun with them this past year.
There was a whole thing with the Navarre as well recently, which culminated in, as I understand it, quite a cool nation coming together sequence to use a magic cauldron full of pop rocks that we provided them with to rededicate a powerful magic item to their nation as a result of stuff they'd done. But Azoth, as you say, also meets with the Academy, occasionally runs night markets with weird esoteric stuff on display, and is also good for having philosophical arguments about the nature of transformation and things. And that is an Eternal that you can do multiple things with. And that is almost the benchmark for what I want for one of our Eternal NPCs. You need to be able to imagine 2 or 3 different types of interactions or opportunities that Eternal will provide. If there's only one, if you only think of one thing that they're going to do, then we need to think again about what they are for, particularly if that one thing overlaps with another Eternal, because we want them to be dynamic. And we also want them to be tools that you want to interact with.
So not all the Eternals are currently active, but they all should have the capacity to be active in one way or another. And if they're not, then that's when we think, okay, something's not right here.
Right. And there are players secretly interacting with the dodgy ones.
There might be.
Oh, no, I'm going to say yes. Yes, there are. And if there weren't, we'd have to question where we'd gone wrong with that Eternal. Because I've met players. And there's a load of different motivations as to why they may be interacting with them. But there are people who have wisely identified that if an Eternal is on the outs with the Empire, that is the perfect time to try and be friendly with them and see if you can get their attention and perhaps a couple of +1 swords out of them for the minimum amount of smashing up wedding cakes.
And sometimes, we've had people walk into the magistrates and say, "I have been talking with an Eternal illegally." They've done it illegally, but not secretly.
That's a choice, and a perfectly valid one. There are spaces for it, as long as they haven't made any deals with an Eternal, I think. As long as they haven't made any deals or provided anything to the Eternal, it's not a crime to speak to them unless they're sorcerers.
Question for the magistrates: isn't that illegal? If there's enmity with the Eternal, you're not supposed to be speaking to them.
The obvious one, of course, would have been the plenipotentiary with agreement that took place last year, which, from the point of view of a plenipotentiary, was pretty much from the player's point of view, did not go well because we cancelled the plenipotentiary because the Archmage wasn't prepared to swear a certain oath. But from the point of view of the drama that it created and the role playing that happened, it was great. It was really good to see the Empire trying to speak to an Eternal who is their enemy, and to do it in a way that allowed them to remain, maintain the moral and ethical high ground. It was a bit tough on the NPC who was playing Agrement, who was sat in a box waiting to come in and do the plenipotentiary, and then we had to break it to him that he was going back to God to get his antlers taken off. Back to Monster to get his antlers taken off. But the role playing that surrounded all of that, and that dodgy Eternal, and the fact the Empire, the Archmage, wasn't prepared to make this dangerous oath just to get a plenipotentiary, was a great triumph, in my opinion, from the point of view of where our plenipotentiaries are going. I was so pleased with how that went.
You've never hesitated to get an NPC into kit and then send them home, like not produce them because the players didn't do the right thing.
The sad thing is that it's happened to Agrement 3 times now, and we've only put him into costume 4 times. But the NPC who's been playing Agrement is resigned to all of that and does see that it is good that the Empire just doesn't want to deal with the devil, basically, and it works out quite nicely. But I do sometimes feel sorry for the NPC because he always gets so excited about the opportunity to play Agrement, and then we go and tell him to take his antlers off and hit the showers.
And if you're counting, folks, just to be clear, that's 3 times out of 4, which means 1 time out of 4, some players did go in and have a glorious encounter with Agrement. It was certainly one we and the crew really enjoyed. I think the players really enjoyed it. So, the more banned they are, the more fun it is to interact with them.
Not that we're encouraging you to do anything that might involve breaking Imperial law, but I would like to draw your attention to the fact that for various reasons there is a communicate with Agrement of a ritual available in Urizen law.
Totally illegal, by the way.
Yeah, don't cast it. It's called Treacher's Quill, if you want, look it up on the wiki and see why you shouldn't cast it.
Okay, I think we've done a pretty good job of covering the Eternals, unless you want to talk about why you disagree about what a drudge is.
I was quite surprised because up until like a fortnight ago, there was an entire extra group of Eternals called soldiers, and then I discovered that Matt had combined them with drudges.
Yeah, when I originally wrote it, there was another category called soldiers. And when I went, one of the things we do is we do a lot of editing, and you look at it and you write a load of words, and you get to the end of it and you realize actually you've got more words here than you needed. So each of those inhabitants of the realm fills a certain kind of story element or a mythic trope. So the boggarts are the playful, sort of tricksy creatures. They are the Trumbles from Star Trek. They are the things that they are the nuisance. They're an infestation of boggarts. So they fill all the roles in stories that you might want an infestation to fill. We talked about Eternals and the role they fill. Guardians are, that great big monster that you want to go and kill is a Guardian. Guardians exist so that when we have a great big monster that the players want to go and kill, or we want the players to kill, or they're being asked to kill, or whatever, we go, what is that thing? It's a Guardian. Heralds are about all of those interactions with the intermediary. You're not talking to the king of the fairies, you're not talking to the prince of hell, but you're talking to somebody in the hierarchy that you can have a conversation with and interact with. And originally we had drudges and we had soldiers, and soldiers were the things that turn up on fights, on battles and fight. And drudges are the sort of, if you go to the feast and the fairy queen says, sit down at my table and we'll have a feast, the drudges are the things that bring out the plates of food. They are the thing that fills that role. Clearly there's a thing there and it is filling that role, but no one is actually interested in it. It's the stage hands. It's the thing that makes all the little moving parts move. And actually, we sort of identified when I went through the cut that the things that you interact with that leave no impression in the Elven Knights of Eleonaris are soldiers or drudges, and it amounts to the same thing. The ones that you have conversations with that have a powerful impact with you and leave you with a role-playing effect, they're heralds. There are heralds in those thousands of Elven Knights that come out, but they're probably the leaders and the champions and the people at the front. The people at the back of that force, soldiers or drudges, but it amounts to the same thing. And they're the same thing that would happen if you did a deal with an Autumn Eternal to summon an army of slaves to work in the Imperial mines to take away all the running costs. What you would be getting out of that would be drudges, but they're the same as soldiers. They're this thing that does a thing, but isn't really interesting to talk to or interact with. They're just there to make sense of what is happening in the scenery, in the scene as the scenery moves.
I'm fine with putting those two roles together because I agree with what you're saying. I just think drudge is the wrong word, and that, ladies and gentlemen, is almost 100% of our game design. We come with a concept in half an hour, and then we spend 3 days arguing about the correct name for it.
Yeah, we've got some stuff coming down the pipeline that I'm working with some players on about trying to do more for players in the sort of 14 to 18-year-old category. And one of our biggest problems is we can't get the right name for the thing that we're going to try and bring in. And we're trying to get we're working away on all the design elements, but it's like we keep coming back to, what are we going to call this thing? There isn't a good name. Naming things is really important. It sounds like it isn't, and it is. Naming things is really important. There's a kind of internet celebrity of this guy who's in marketing. I can't remember his name now, but he's on lots of little YouTube videos where he talks about like great marketing fails of the. I just saw him last night talking about nuclear energy, and he's like, who decided to name nuclear power after nuclear bombs? That's the worst marketing move in history. He's like, I should have called it anything but nuclear power. And that's a silly example. But that idea that names are really, really important is something we think a lot about.
When that name was chosen, nuclear was cool. It was cool to be atomic. It was the atomic age. They named the bikini to the place where they had tested the atomic bombs so that they could get some of the cool of atomic bombs on the bikinis.
It was only later that people would sour on nuclear weapons for some reason. I can't think why people might have decided they were, in hindsight, a bit like our game really. In hindsight, this deal was less cool than it first appeared. It's almost like the Winter Eternals were there offering you a deal.
Yeah, well, there's always people who are ready to massacre a village without asking tricky questions about who lives there or why.
Oh, they really are. It's great. And then we make them do it in uptime, and on at least one occasion where that has happened, they have balked.
Interesting. Yeah, different. If you thought it was going to be in downtime.
Yes, it's a long ago story, and I don't want to drag it out because I think there are still players involved in it. But essentially, some people had bragged that they would be prepared to commit a certain atrocity, and when they got there and discovered that the atrocity was being fizz-repped by members of the academy, they got cold feet.
Yeah, brutally murdering children is less cool when they're fizz-repped by children.
I was trying not to use any overtly triggering phrases, but yeah.
Great that there are players who would get into that situation.
I mean, our game's all about exploring moral dilemmas and, looking at the interplay of power and morality. Of course, that's where we're at right now in the current campaign, although in a way, gloriously, that's got nothing to do with Eternals. But our game is really all about the interplay of power and morality, because the company's called Profound Decisions. It's about making decisions. It's about deciding whether to do this thing or not to do this thing. And if the thing was just obviously advantageous and good, you would just do it. And if it was obviously disadvantageous and bad, you wouldn't do it. It has to be complex and have many, sort of competing elements in favor of it and against it to get that interplay of power. And the point is, things like morality is really great in a LARP context, because you can all argue about, just like we do in the real world, well, what is the right thing to do here? How much should we do this thing? How much should we not do this thing? Yeah, if we'd written Lord of the Rings, they'd have got to the Council of Elrond and had a very long discussion about, whether or not destroying the One Ring was the right thing to do or not. The discussion, it wouldn't really be, in a classic fantasy, you go on the quest, whereas we want you to decide whether the quest was worth it in the first place. So it's and Eternals play into that. They're all about poking at this confluence of morality and power and economics and advantage and disadvantage and costs and benefits. But they do it in a way that's very magical and very story related, which is the opposite of the way things like the Druge or the Toon or the Commonwealth would work, because the mortals in Empire live in a world of realpolitik, where they have agendas and do things for very realpolitik reasons, whereas the Eternals live in a world of story, where for them these things are just cut and dried, and they just like, well, do this. But because the players don't live in that world, they have to decide how much they're going to acquiesce to that. Yeah.
Well, that was very interesting. I really enjoyed that. I think we'll stop there. We've covered Eternals pretty well.
The newer page about Eternals and ritual law should, as Matt says, be going up in a couple of days. The new pages that we've done more recently went up a couple of weeks ago. They're all linked off the bottom of Eternals. And the ritual I was talking about that allows you to send messages to Agrement is called Treacherous Quill. You can also find it linked off the table at the bottom of Origin Law if you just want to go and have a look at that and see how bad it is and how wrong it would be for you to find an Origin to cast that ritual for you. It'd be bad. I'm definitely not encouraging it. It is illegal, as it says at the top of the page, while Agrement is subject to enmity. So, second thoughts, don't go and look at it at all.
Yeah, don't even look at it. That would be bad.
Don't even look at it.
But if you do cast it, send a press release to the Oathright.
Imagine what a scoop interviewing Agrement might be for the Oathright.
Why
I done it. Agrement's story in his own words. Oh man, I'm joking, of course, but I do remember being interviewed by a newspaper playing Sodogwa in the early years and being asked a lot of candid questions. It was quite entertaining. Newspapers are great, by the way. I'm not just saying that.
And the story we had on Sodogwa's recent interviews, it's Inquisition. We had a great story about his Inquisition. Sounds like you had fun doing that one.
That was a lot of fun, really challenging, and as I've said every time it's brought up, major kudos to all the players involved in that, particularly the assorted marchers with the Down with Sodogwa agenda and the marchers with the Up with Sodogwa agenda. Lovely to see the background. That was so nice, and it's one of the things that makes NPCing fun, is that kind of scene with lots of difficult questions. And while I'm answering a question about the ethics of prosperity out the corner of my eye, I can see one of our NPCs, Neil, handing out popcorn to people so that they can appreciate the silliness that is going on all the better. And that was just great. That's when the Eternals really pop, when they're giving players opportunities to do a load of stuff and disagree with each other and things. And that Inquisition was a great example of that, I think. Anyway.
Yeah, excellent. So thanks a lot for that. Thanks, Matt and Andy.
Thank you. Yeah, we really enjoyed that.
Yeah. Cheers, Angus.
Thanks, Andy and Matt. I'm looking forward to more cultist shenanigans this year. And thanks to everyone who listened to this podcast on Eternals. We'll do more of these, so if you have ideas for future subjects or general feedback, please send it to feedback@profounddecisions.co.uk.